Wireless LAN Professionals Podcast, episode 190.
There's a lot of hype where you'll hear 5G can replace Wi-Fi. Well, technically, yes, and technically Wi-Fi could replace cellular. You could put a dense array of Wi-Fi hotspots like everywhere and set it up with fast handoffs. But that's not going to happen, right?
Wireless LAN Professionals is a place to educate, inform, encourage, and entertain those involved in wireless LANs. This Wireless LAN Professionals podcast is an audio manifestation of these goals. Our host is a wireless LAN veteran, consultant, designer, and teacher, Keith Parsons. And now, the podcast for wireless LAN professionals by wireless LAN professionals.
Welcome back to Wireless LAN Professionals podcast. My name is Keith Parsons, and today I have with me Phil Solis. Phil, how are you today?
Good. How are you? Thank you for having me.
Well, I met you when you were presenting at Wi-Fi Now in DC, and thought the presentation you gave there would be a really useful thing to talk to our audience about. Our audience is people who do wireless LANs day in, day out. And first, a little introduction. You're a research director at IDC, but you're specifically over mobile connectivity. And what's your focus at IDC?
Yeah, sure. So for a long time, I've covered wireless and mobile connectivity, and that's what I cover at IDC. So that includes everything from Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, NFC, to proprietary technologies and cellular technologies, cellular IoT as well. That's
a really broad range. I'm kind of impressed because
it is.
Those have actually quite different technologies underneath them.
Right, and different network infrastructures, different uses, different costs.
Yeah, and not to mention just a whole bunch of different terms that they use as well. But as we're moving closer to Wi-Fi 6 becoming reality, and well, it is at least on the AP side, and 5G, there's a lot of talk about those two. And at the Wi-Fi Now conference, you kind of gave an overview of where we can see those two working together. Would you mind kind of repeating that for this audience? Where 5G, Wi-Fi and 5G, where do you see them working together, apart, against each other, however?
Right. So because of their cost differences and how it's geared, right? I guess let's start with where they intersect, right? They're intersecting in a place where it's called like private cellular networks, right? Like private 4G, private 5G networks, right? So that's basically where cellular can be used as a wireless LAN technology, right? But Wi-Fi is the original private network, right? That's used. So, they, of course you see Wi-Fi in consumer setting, like at home, in businesses, it's used as hotspots. Cellular connectivity is sort of the opposite, right? It's run by companies that can cover a whole country and give you, fast handoffs and fluid connectivity everywhere, at least in theory, right? So, but cellular networks originally were never really meant to go indoors, but they do, and with lower spectrum bands they do. But still, it's not perfect everywhere, and you have different constructions of buildings, and somebody may be in a basement, and so Wi-Fi is a good way to provide additional coverage. You can do that with cellular, of course, as well, but that's there's different ways of doing that with DAS, small cells. There's things like femtocells that came up, even consumer femtocells, but that's more expensive. So they're highly complementary technologies, definitely. And even, there's a lot of hype where you'll hear 5G can replace Wi-Fi. Well, technically, yes, and technically Wi-Fi could replace cellular. You could put a dense array of Wi-Fi hotspots like everywhere and set it up with fast handoffs. But that's not going to happen, right? So the two technologies will be used in conjunction with each other. And the biggest place you'll see them is, of course, in smartphones, where the volumes are still tremendous. The volumes may be falling right now, just a tad, but they're still enormous. And that's where you'll see the biggest jump with 5G. And complementing that would be Wi-Fi 6.
And Wi-Fi 6, we're anticipating some new things coming from Apple in a couple of weeks. Do you anticipate Wi-Fi 6 will be in this round?
Yeah.
I know I don't want you to predict the future, but.
No, but I expect that it would be. It's late this year is around the time that you would see them start coming into handsets, with the exception of the Galaxy S10 line that did incorporate Wi-Fi 6 now already. But I would expect that it would. I mean, it doesn't necessarily, it might not necessarily have it, but I would expect that it would.
What about handsets using CBRS 3.5 gig?
My smartphone right now supports that. Right? I have a Google Pixel 3 XL. It's a year old and it has it. So I think you'll see more and more handsets supporting that as well. Absolutely.
Well, it's included in a lot of the Qualcomm chips. It's just whether or not people have been turning them on.
Right. Yeah. So the smartphone OEM has to enable that in the design, including the RF that supports that band. Right. And then even if it does support it, the software has to be turned on as well. So if the mobile operator is not currently using it, they may not necessarily have that at the ready, but you'll see that more and more.
Well, and we do have a lot of mobile phone manufacturers who aren't necessarily that closely tied to individual cell carriers.
Right.
So talking on the next level, CBRS, it's new. It's mostly in the U.S. It's a version of private LTE that is not tied to the carriers as much as previous versions were. What do you anticipate in the future for CBRS in the US?
Yeah, there's a lot of potential there, right? And so it's just new spectrum that can be used that's not exactly tied to carriers, but could be. So there's 3 tiers of that. The first tier being the current incumbent users that get the top priority of access, and then for everybody else, there's the priority access and then the non-priority access. And so at the bottom for the non-priority access, that's just using it as unlicensed spectrum, but just instead of sharing it equally with everybody, you have to, the clients would give, and networks would give priority to the first 2 tiers. So this middle tier is the most interesting part, especially that's what's going to be leveraged for private cellular networks or private LTE networks. And
we haven't figured out yet what that's going to cost. I mean, that auction part of that isn't there yet. So
yeah, right.
Is it going to be, only carriers can play? They run the price up that high, or is it something where an enterprise could be able to play?
It should be something where an enterprise will be able to play. I mean, I think geographically, it's going to look very different, right? In a rural area, well, you probably don't even need something like that. And in certain suburbs, you may or may not need that. And then maybe a limited number of companies willing to spend on that. So where it gets interesting is somewhere like Manhattan. Let's say Penn Station in Manhattan, New York. There are a ton of companies literally on top of each other, right, vertically. And they can all potentially bid on that. The company that operates the Madison Square Garden, they run their own Wi-Fi network, and they're looking into private cellular networks, of course, like everybody else. But then there's the Mass Transit Authority, and there's the other companies in that building, and there's other companies around that building. So there are a lot of potential companies who could bid on that spectrum. Not all of them could get that. There's a limited number of licenses, right?
But at least they're geographically fairly small, given the frequencies that we're playing with.
Yes. But still, like in a very dense urban area, even as small as those geo areas are going to be, there are dozens to hundreds of companies in that tiny spot.
But that's where they like living there, so they're on top of each other.
Yeah, well, yeah, exactly.
Well, one of the articles I read that you had written a little while ago was about the fairly decent and large change from Apple moving from Intel to Qualcomm when they finished up with their little legal wranglings. Can you give us a little, your take on that situation with Apple and Qualcomm?
Yeah, sure. That's definitely very interesting. High volumes involved there. And then for Intel, that was really essentially their only customer, Apple. So, Apple, they're shrewd. They typically will play vendors off of each other, right? Like, for example, and then they'll do things like with like dialogue, right? Where they kind of, they wind up becoming a significant portion of a company's revenue. Then they pull out, and then, well, now that company is, they don't know what to do with that now, and it's just a big drop in revenue. So they sell it back to Apple. So Apple gets it at a discount, and so they're still using it, and now they own it.
What? You think they did that on purpose?
Maybe it's just a coincidence, maybe. But they're a shrewd company, right? So in the case with where you have Intel and Qualcomm involved, right? It's a little bit more complicated. But I think I personally think Apple got very lucky and things happened to work out very, very well for them. Where, they could have stuck with Intel. I think where Intel may have been behind on was the development of millimeter wave modules, which are very critical to using 5G in the US because that's what a lot of, big carriers have available at first. So, but they supposedly Apple wasn't happy with where Intel was at. They could have potentially left millimeter wave out in the first version and just used the sub 6 gigahertz 5G spectrum and LTE spectrum. But then they probably saw that as being risky by the time fall of 2020 came around to do that. Maybe consumers wouldn't be happy with that. Carriers wouldn't be happy with that. So they wound up wrapping up their things with Qualcomm, settling very quickly and working on that. And, Qualcomm is, except for the captive semiconductor vendors, Qualcomm is powering all the 5G phones today. And so it's a safe move for them to make is to, to quit the legal wranglings with Apple and with Qualcomm, and then utilize Qualcomm for their 2020 phones.
You got to, give it to them. They have to be thinking 2, 3, 4 years out. And because these chip developers are developing the next gen and the next gen.
Right.
And they've got to be playing, be in that game. And they obviously saw something in the future and made a decision now about it.
Right. And it's, this is just actually like a medium term move because Apple's long term move is to create their own chipsets here, right? And people they didn't believe that they could do that for the application processor, and they did it.
And Qualcomm's got to see the writing on the wall, but they're saying,
yes.
In the meantime, let's we own the market, so let's continue moving forward.
Exactly, and actually, if you looked at the announcement with Qualcomm, that if you read between the lines there, you could see exactly, Qualcomm knew what Apple's plans are. It was worked into the arrangement. Because they did a licensing agreement for a lot longer than they stated. Maybe it was vague, but the shorter term.
Yeah, didn't they license like 6 years or something?
Yes, 6-year licensing agreement, and the agreement was a multi-year agreement to purchase modems. So multi-year means at least 2. Right? So 2020 phones and 2021 phones, but it could mean 3, and that's like about the time frame where. Apple could very well have their own baseband processor, right, that they would integrate into the SoC. That's what they've been wanting to do. They've probably approached Qualcomm in the past to license their baseband IP from them, and Qualcomm didn't want to do that. Right? So now they can, and they've purchased, the smartphone business from Intel, smartphone chipset business for baseband processors. Probably even some of the RF work that they were doing around millimeter wave. And now they can, in the long term, they can integrate that into what they're working on. And for several years, you can see they've had job postings for, engineers for baseband processors for RF, sub 6 gigahertz and millimeter wave.
Following this is kind of your job. What do you see with the other manufacturers, Huawei, Samsung?
Well, so Samsung has been using their own SoCs increasingly over the years. So they're relying on Qualcomm less and less, but it's easy to rely on Qualcomm because of they're certified on the carriers, and carriers are content with the Qualcomm's chips on their network. But and there was a time where Samsung was like a bit behind Qualcomm, especially with integration, but also just the features they would support in the application processors and the baseband processors. But for the last several years, they've been, especially the last few years, they've really have been caught up, and they have a good chip, and they're using their own chip more and more. Samsung also would like to not just be a captive vendor, but be a merchant vendor and sell into the market, and they've had very, very limited success with that. I think a Chinese company called Meizu has bought their chips on and off, but and then there's High Silicon is a different story, right? And they've also integrated their solutions over time, and they've had better and better features in their chips as well, and they're also using their own chips more and more. But of course, with High Silicon, it gets a little bit more complicated around Huawei, and the geopolitical situation that's going on.
Yeah, we'll just leave that one where it is.
Yeah, that's a whole nother discussion.
So what kind of amazes me is the amount of possible usages inside a little teeny smartphone that you have in your pocket for the total number of different frequencies and technologies that they all have to coexist, especially looking forward from, you still have to support 2G and 3G and 4G and 5G and Wi-Fi 6 and Wi-Fi 5 and Wi-Fi 4. And some of them still even have FM capabilities on the chip. Where do you see those chips going in the future? I mean, like, all going SDR? Or are they going to maintain discrete components?
Yeah, SDR has always been interesting, especially given the number of spectrum bands that phones have to support. But typically, power consumption has been an issue. But I still see that as probably being the future of what phones, where they'll go. But in the meantime, more solutions for around RF are becoming more and more integrated. I think typically you see, like, let's say Apple, they may get a piece from Skyworks and a piece from Qorvo to cover, different sets of bands. And maybe some of that becomes more integrated because now you're layering on millimeter wave on top of that. It's an interesting space for Qualcomm, because for Qualcomm they've done some RF, but they've never really sold it before. But now they are with the 5G SoCs, especially with Chinese OEMs. So now they're selling the SoC, like Snapdragon, and they're also selling. Well, so millimeter wave modules have to be tightly coupled with the application processor, right, and the baseband processor. Sorry, the baseband processor. And so typically, right, at least for now, you'll see whoever sells the SoC will also sell the millimeter wave module. There will be third-party millimeter wave modules. And those vendors will come up, the startups like Movandi, for example, but they're going to have to work closely with other companies. But so for Qualcomm, now they're selling the SoC and the millimeter wave, and then they're also selling the sub-6 gigahertz RF as well. So that's all upside for Qualcomm. But tight integration in RF is absolutely critical, because the RF part of the phone is where more and more spectrum bands are being supported. And then, so there's a large amount of filters for all that. But then LTE has gone to 2x2, and in the higher end phones, it's 4x4 MIMO. So you need 4 times the number of filters for each spectrum band that you support. Right. And
it still has to fit inside of a smartphone case.
Right. And then you're adding the millimeter wave modules, which are completely separate modules, and they can't leverage the same transceiver. They have their own transceivers in them, and you need at least 3, and some of them will be 4 or 5 in the future, but you need 3 because they're so directional. Your hand can block it, so you want at least one of them to be able to get a connection
at any one time, however you hold it.
Right.
So a couple other items. One is just your take on this situation I've seen over the last 10 years or so. Cellular companies are all about ARPU and making sure they can maximize revenue per user.
Right.
And yet they also do Wi-Fi offloading to lower their costs. But the same people who do Wi-Fi offloading to lower their costs also sell a little MiFi hotspot, which is the opposite of Wi-Fi offloading. How do you reconcile within those cell companies why they're actually fighting against themselves in that process? Yeah,
exactly. So it depends on what you're using it, when, where, how. So the mobile routers, right, with mobile Wi-Fi routers are used to give devices that only have Wi-Fi a mobile connection through that device, right? But some people use their phones to do that. But the problem with using your phone is that then you eat through your phone's battery faster, which may not be an issue for some people, but for others it would be. And then I guess cellular carriers would like to just have cellular technology enabled in all those devices and not just in the only Wi-Fi devices. And there's been limited success with cellular technology being included and used, turned on in PCs and tablets. And I think you're seeing LTE come up more like in smartwatches, right? Like cellular IoT. They're using LTE Cat-M. So it's coming up in smartwatches. But in PCs and tablets, it's always been, a limited amount of usage there, because people could just connect through their phone as a hotspot or use those mobile hotspots.
But then at the same time, they're selling, buying from other retailers the Wi-Fi offloading so that they don't have to put it over their own network.
Right, and that's for, because the majority of the data traffic is created by smartphones. That's the device everyone carries and uses the most, right? Somebody may also carry a tablet with them, have it in the car, or put it in a purse or something, and they may use that as well. But really, people are just using their phones. The screens are bigger. It's their one device that kind of they use the most, with the tablet, PC, and smartwatch used here and there on the sides. So the smartphone is a device that's creating all that traffic usage, right? It's not going to be like using the Wi-Fi hotspot to use a PC here and there, or get turning on a cellular connection in a car so the kids Nintendo can connect or something like that, right? It's really the smartphones are creators of the traffic, so they're making these deals for Wi-Fi offload and making sure that the phones have the best, at least the high-end phones that get used heavily, have the best Wi-Fi technology in them so that they can offload that traffic.
Well, one last question here for you, Phil. You were in D.C. when the FCC chairman talked, and the big topic there at Wi-Fi Now conference was on 6 gigahertz. Well, they kind of tied it to Wi-Fi 6 and 6 gig, but those are entirely two different things. What's your take on both for the U.S. and globally when we might see the 6 gigahertz open up to unlicensed?
Yeah, I think, by the time you have commercial devices leveraging that, it'll probably be, it's got to be like more than a year from now. It could be a year and a half, 2 years from now that you would see those devices in use. That's great that that's happening. I mean, it not only provides more spectrum for any unlicensed usage, right, for any technology, but for Wi-Fi devices using that, this Wi-Fi gets a fresh start on a brand new sheet of paper. Only Wi-Fi 6, 802.11ax will be used in that newer spectrum, which means, right, as we keep getting, we are from B to G, right? But if you're using G and you have a B device on it, it was slowing it down a little bit, but okay, not a huge deal. It wasn't that fast anyway. But then you went to N, still connects down to G or B. In an enterprise setting, they can turn off B and G or whatever they want, right, to keep the network cleaner. But generally, maybe they didn't, or they had legacy devices anyway. And for consumers, they have legacy devices. And you go to AC, you still have some old devices that you could probably have an 11G device connected on the AC network, but definitely a lot of 11N devices, and that slows down the network. But now with Wi-Fi 6, you're in a situation where you have this more spectrum, and it's only going to be used by Wi-Fi 6, which means that it's going to be used extremely efficiently. And with so much more spectrum, that means you can do a lot more usage of larger channel sizes. Channels have gone up to 80 megahertz. You could do 160 megahertz. In Wi-Fi 7, so 11BE, you'll be able to do 320 megahertz channels even. So it's a really good thing, and it also helps position Wi-Fi as a strong alternative to a solution where they're looking at private cellular networks, 4G and 5G.
Well, Phil, thank you very much for your time today talking about Wi-Fi 5, Qualcomm chips, kind of a wide gamut there of where we're going. If someone wanted to follow you either on Twitter or LinkedIn, how would they track you down?
Yeah, sure. On Twitter, I'm Phil Solis, so it's PhilSolis. And on LinkedIn, I'm Philip Solis with one L, PhilipSolis. And
website?
And website is idc.com. IDC.
Oh, that's an easy one to remember.
Yes, nice and short.
Well, good. We'll put links to those in the show notes as well. Phil, again, thank you for your time, and I appreciate your sharing your information with us today.
I'm glad to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
10 Talks.
Just talk to me on using Docker and Ansible to help automate the staging of a wireless LAN controller. Keith's little talk this morning shamed me into taking out my introduction slides. So I'm Jamie Jackson. You can find me on Twitter at TechieJames. I try and stay pretty active on there, and I do have a blog, y-fi.comptechie.net. So first of all, I've never met the guy, But I think anyone who's on Twitter sees so many references to tacos in the cloud that I figured I would put a taco in the cloud. Yeah. Anyways, on to the less important stuff. So disclaimers. This process is designed for a Cisco controller, AirOS based. I'm not inventing anything new with this process. Auto install, config tools, they've been around forever. I just wanted to personally learn Docker and Ansible, and I wanted to do it in a practical way. I think that's the way a lot of us learn, and so I wanted to do something that I could actually use in my day-to-day life. I'm not a subject matter expert on any of this, so if I say something incorrect, find me afterwards, hit me up on Twitter. That's how I learn. That's how we all learn. So, and then I will do an upcoming set of blog posts that do a deeper dive of stuff I can't cover in 10 minutes here. So, first of all, what is Docker? The really dumbed down version that's not entirely correct, but is easy to conceptualize, is that it's like virtual machines, but for individual applications and services. You create an image. That image has the app or service that you're going to want on there, any dependencies that it needs. And then you take that image and you can deploy it out as a container to multiple different hosts. Essentially, if a platform can run Docker, it should be able to run your container. Sometimes you got dependencies that isn't necessarily true, but it's kind of platform agnostic. And containers can be easily created. It's literally a one line to create a container, and you can create them. They scale really easily and quickly. So what's in my Docker? I am using an Ubuntu base image on there, and I have three things in there. One is a DHCP server. It's used to provide an IP address to my controller, and an option 150 to point my controller to the proper TFTP server. So I have a TFTP server as well. That hosts the base config file, and that's used to stage my factory reset controller via auto install. And the third portion is Ansible, and all of its dependencies that it needs to run. And I'm using that particularly to build configuration snippets based on a provided input file. My host configuration is this MacBook with a USB-C Ethernet adapter on there. And I had some problems with Docker for Mac and networking, so I'm running that actually I'm running Docker in a virtual machine on my Mac. I have two NICs configured. One is just my normal NATed one for Wi-Fi for internet. The important one is that USB adapter. I have that bridged through to my virtual machine, and that adapter plugs into my wireless controller into the service port. And that's how I get DHCP from my container to the controller. Ansible really briefly uses Playbooks to perform tasks on a list of hosts. That's a very basic version. This is an example of one that I have in there. This is a portion of my playbook. This is going to create any WPA2 WLANs that I have defined variables for. So anyone that's used Cisco command line, you can see that under the lines, these are just the commands that you would normally be typing in to create a WLAN. And then I have some variable fields defined in there, and I'll show you here in a couple minutes. That's where I'm going to set up the different variables for the different SSIDs that I want to stage on there. So we'll just pop into my demo here. This first one here, this is Docker. So on the left-hand side, this is my VM where I have Docker installed, and it's literally one line to start this container up. Doesn't take much. There. That's all it takes. And you can see my prompt changed on there. I'm in the container now. I'm still within my terminal, but I'm running my container just like SSHing into something. I'm in my container. I do need to start DHCP and TFTP. I don't have those set to auto start in this particular example. So I'm going to start those. And now I'm ready. That's all it took to set up my container and have it ready to go. So on the right-hand side here, this is just my controller that I had before it was configured. With a base config before it was factory reset. You can see it's got a little bit of a config on it, not much. And you can see I can't get to it anymore because I've reset it. So we're going to pop into the auto install, or I'm rebooting the controller at this point. While that's going, I did a Wireshark on there. You can see my DHCP ACK has my option 150 in there that I defined, and that option 150 address is the IP address of my container. Okay, we're into the auto install portion now. So auto install is going to look for a few different pre-configured file names. The one that I've named it is Cisco willc-confg. That's the third one it looks for, and it did find that. So once it finds that config file, it's going to apply to the controller, and it's going to reboot again. So I got a ping going just so I can see when I get responses. So I got responses now. In the terminal, you can see that I'm back to I can actually log in now. I didn't have web mode enabled, so I'm going to enable that real quick. There we go. I'm back in my controller. Same base config I had on that before I factory reset it. Second part of this is the Ansible portion. So we'll pop in that. And in here, this is the same controller, same everything, same base config on it. You can see I've just got one little test WLAN on there. I've got no interfaces other than the normal ones assigned on there. And then I don't have any Radius servers assigned here either. So we'll go into Ansible here. First thing, this is my variables file. This is what that playbook is going to look at when it's building the WLANs that you've designated in there. So in this particular example, I have set up 3 interfaces, 2 WPA2 WLANs, and 1 .1x WLAN. So my playbook is going to go through and it's going to build the appropriate amount of WLANs and push them out to the controller. This is 7.6 for the controllers. It's a one-liner to start your playbook. So really it's like 2 lines to run this whole process. It's very, very simple. So it's running here. It was able to connect to my controller, and it's going to start running some tasks here. And so we'll see, right now it's running my add interface task. So it's going to loop through and it's going to add however many interfaces I defined in there. In this case, 3. So it's adding those. It's going to add the appropriate amount of WPA2 WLANs, which is 2. And then the last thing it's going to do is my 1.1x WLAN. So went through, I didn't get any error messages, anything like that. And if we look in here, I now have 3 WLANs, 2 of them being WPA2 PSK, 1 being a .1x. And then I've got more interfaces in there. And finally, I have a Radius server in there. So that's the process. Very high level. Obviously, I didn't really give anything into how that was built, but the blog post that I'm going to put out there going to show you kind of how you can do this. And even if you don't use Cisco, Aruba has a module for Ansible. And really, you could take this idea and you could really do it with any vendor. You may have to adapt it, but it's a good learning opportunity. So if you want to learn Ansible or Docker or just one or either, hopefully this can provide some input on that. And I got 7 seconds left, so I'm going to leave early. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of the Wireless LAN Professionals Podcast, the podcast for wireless LAN professionals by wireless LAN professionals. Be sure to follow us on Twitter at Wireless LAN Pros for all the latest news and updates, and also connect directly with Keith on Twitter at Keith R. Parsons. Head over to www.wlanpros.com for this episode's show notes, as well as the latest in all things Wi-Fi.